Mike Gousha. This is On the Issues. Today we are releasing our latest Marquette University Law School poll. With me, as always, for that occasion is Professor Charles Franklin. He's the director of the poll, and we've got a lot to talk about today. We'll begin the way we always begin, because we do think it's helpful for people to know when the poll was done, who we've been talking to, and the fact that these are live interviews. So, Charles, why don't you tell us when we were in the field and cell phones and all that good stuff.
So we interviewed people on last Thursday through Sunday. That was May 15th through the 18th. We kept our usual sample size, 805 people this time. And those are divided between cell phones, which are about a little over 30% of the actual interviews, landline, about 2/3, 66%. When you weight the data, which we do by age, education, sex, and region, all those young people with cell phones boost that up a little bit, so the weighted sample is about 40% cell phone. But that's entirely due to young people with heavy cell phone use. And so we asked a variety of questions using our standard methodology. We haven't changed any of the methodology for quite a while now. And a variety of issues, which you'll find out about in just a minute.
Margin of error, Charles, for these results?
Thank you. With 805 respondents, the margin of error is 3.5 percentage points, plus or minus. When we look at smaller subgroups, that margin of error gets bigger.
Well, we're going to begin with the gubernatorial race and see where we stand. We've been polling on that since the first of the year, and we'll, I guess, go right out of the gates and look at the horse race. And this time it's Governor Walker and I guess, one of the Democratic candidates, now we can say that, but Mary Burke. So a Walker-Burke matchup.
All right. 2 or 3 releases ago, we spent some time taking you through the state of the state and how the budget was doing and things like that. And one of my Twitter friends from D.C. complained that the suspense was too much. So this is to satisfy the Twitterverse that just can't wait for the main result. And
they're not in Washington spending their time on the taxpayer dime watching our polling results.
No. These are people who do politics for a living. 46-46, a tie. That's quite a shift from 48-41, where it stood in our March data, and 47-41 in January. Though earlier, back in October, we had the race just 47-45, a 2-point race. So there's been considerable convergence over this last 2-month period, and we'll show you a few other details about it in just a minute.
So this is registered voters, correct, Charles? And we're going to go and break this down a little bit further. Likely voters and likely and enthusiastic voters.
Exactly. So registered voters, of course, are just what they sound like, registered. Or if they're not currently registered, they say they're certain that they're going to register by election day. Now, in a presidential year, that's a pretty good sample of most of the voters in the state, because we have an extraordinarily high turnout in any year, but in presidential years especially so. But in midterm years, registered voters will not all go to the polls. And so one of the questions is, who's going to vote? And what difference does it make for the margin in the race? So if we look at it that way, here it is for likely voters. Walker at 48, Burke at 45. That's inside the margin of error of 3.5 of the total sample, and here actually a little bit bigger margin of error. So still a statistical dead heat among likely voters. We have a very simple definition of likely voters. Some pollsters have very complicated models for it. We trust people to tell us. And so our question is, are you absolutely certain you're going to vote? Is it likely you're going to vote? Is it 50-50 or so on? And likely voters are those people who say they're absolutely certain they'll vote. Now, I want to put an important caveat on this. there's lots of research that shows likelihood of voting fluctuates a good deal over the course of the election year. And especially until we get into the fall, around Labor Day or so, likely voter models fluctuate quite a bit as people's enthusiasms rise or fall. So I'm showing you this because it's an important question about who turns out, and it's an indicator of current enthusiasm. But the registered voters are a more stable population. Between now and at least the beginning of the fall, we'll expect to see these likely voters fluctuate a good deal more. And when they fluctuate, you don't know whether they're fluctuating because their preference between Burke and Walker has changed, or whether it's simply who's enthusiastic and certain to vote has changed. So that's the important caveat about looking at likely voters. The registered voters should be more stable, at least in the meantime.
You mentioned the word enthusiasm. Let's add that to the list here.
In the last several years, there's been a boom of interest in which voters are really motivated to get to the polls, which party's doing a good job of contacting them, building their enthusiasm, whether on the phone or face-to-face or through social media. So we've been asking a question: how enthusiastic are you about voting in November? And so the next slide combines people who say they are likely to vote, certain to vote, and also say they're very enthusiastic about voting in November. And there the margin goes to Walker at 50 and Burke at 45. So the key point here is the takeaway from the survey is 46-46 for registered voters. These last two slides show you how much motivation can play a role here, and at the moment, the more likely voters are a little more pro-Walker, though not statistically significantly so. And if we add in this measure of enthusiasm and excitement, then Walker's advantage inches up a shade more.
Let's talk about the party ID. In other words, who did we sample, and how did they identify themselves?
Actually, let me do something that this is my fault. I didn't send you this slide. My bad. This is the last minute edition. I wanted to show you all of the polling data by us and by everyone else for the race. And so the little circles are individual polls. This pair of circles right here is this current poll at 46-46. And the straight lines are simple trend line estimates across all of the different polls. St. Norbert poll for Wisconsin Public Radio had a very high support for Governor Walker in their last poll, and you can see it's a bit of an outlier compared to the rest of the data. So the lighter lines include the St. Norbert, the darker lines exclude that outlier. You can see ultimately it's not making a whole lot of difference. The two lines are pretty close to each other anyway. But the upshot of all of this across all of the polling is the current trend estimate would be 47 for Walker, 45 for Burke. Again, a very close race, no matter how you cut it.
And our polling?
And our polling has this trend. I told you this verbally before. We had seen a 2-point race in October that expanded to 6 and then to 7 points, and now has converged to a dead heat. So that's our polling over these last several months.
All right, now let's talk about how the folks in this survey define themselves politically.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no,
By the way. Party identification is one of the things that's critical to people's self-perceptions about politics. And we saw some movement on that this time. So that in the current sample, Republicans are 24% of the sample, Democrats 32%, and Independents 41%. That's a bit of a movement from the March data and actually also the January data. But in March, Republicans were 25%, hardly any different. But in March, Democrats were 27, so they've gone up 5 points between March and this sample. And independents were 44 in March and 41 now. So there's clearly been some movement of more people identifying as Democrats. The question you might ask is that a bump up, or was March the more unusual month? One of the things we saw in March was some evidence that Democrats were more reluctant to call themselves Democrats and instead preferred to call themselves independents. Though when asked, are you closer to the Democratic Party, would say yes. And so as a result, with the leaned party, people leaning to one party or another, our Democrat-Republican gap was about the same as it normally is. But with the simple Dem or Rep comparison, it was just this 2-point 27-25 margin. So a last way of putting this in perspective is if you look at all of our polls since January of 2012, so that's over 17,000 people in the state that we've interviewed. Over that whole period, Republicans have been 27%, Democrats 31%, and independents 38%. So that suggests the current sample is very close to the long-running Democratic average. It's a shade light by 2 or 3 points on the Republican side, and just a shade heavy on the independent side. In addition to all of these things that move around, partly that reflects enthusiasm. We've seen some other things that you'll see later, but in national data, President Obama's approval rating has pulled up. Disapproval of the Affordable Care Act has come down a bit. Those are all things that at the margin move partisans from being just a little partisan to being just a little independent. And then finally, just simple sampling error can also be part of this.
Let's run through a couple of questions that we've asked on all of our polls this year, at least when it comes to the governor's race. Let's get a job approval rating for Governor Walker. Sure. In there.
And here, despite the fact that the vote moved closer, his job approval actually tipped up just a little bit. In May, we have 49% approval to 46% disapproval. That would be here. Back in March, it was a 47-47 tie. So this is a good example of how you may think that if the sample moves in a partisan direction, a more Democratic direction, every measure would naturally move in a Democratic direction. That does happen with the vote. But here, with job approval, it actually is the opposite. It moves to modestly improve the governor's job approval.
Is the state moving in the right direction, or are we on the wrong track? It's a question we ask every time out.
Every time out, especially with unified government, it's pretty easy to decide whether you should credit or blame one party or the other. And here, opinion is still quite solidly that we're headed in the right direction. 52% right direction, 42% wrong track. That's hardly changed. In March, it was 54% right direction and also 42% wrong track. So inside the margin of error for any kind of change in that. We've seen this measure for now several months, holding in the low 50s for right direction, holding in the low 40s for wrong track. And of course, as those of you who rushed out to watch the governor's first TV commercials after announcing his run, part of the theme of the campaign is the state is moving forward again.
And as part of that theme, the governor talks about the budget and what he inherited and where we are today. And so we asked a question about the state budget, how people perceive that.
So we ask, is the state budget... I'm not going to start coughing, I swear. Is the state budget in better shape now, or about the same, or worse shape than it was a few years ago? People are pretty optimistic. 48% better, 22% the same, 25% worse. The last time we asked this question was back in January. right at the time of the State address and at the time that a new budget surplus was identified or expected. And back in January, it was not much change, 49% better, 26% about the same, and 20% worse than a few years ago. So in general, a pretty positive view to the state of the budget and some minor fluctuation at the low end.
Another obvious issue in this race is job creation. And Democrats are saying we're not creating jobs as fast as our neighbors and we're lagging the national average. And the governor's saying we've had some of the best jobs numbers in more than 10 years in Wisconsin. So you're getting that back and forth. How do people feel about how we're doing?
A considerable dispute about this in terms of what the data show and how they're interpreted and presented. But the public has been moderately stable on this. 13% say we're adding jobs faster than other states, 38% about the same, and 43% say we're lagging behind. In March, it was 12 faster, 37 the same, and 45 lagging. So again, those differences are well within the margin of error. Doesn't look like very much change. We've seen a little movement over the last year and a half or so on lagging behind. It's been as high as 49%. It's been as low as 40%. So right now at 43, it's towards the middle or maybe slightly below middle of that range that it's taken on.
One of the things we've seen in...
Excuse me, I just wanted to add, the poll was in the field just as the latest jobs numbers came out. So the timing is not really clear whether those jobs numbers had been out long enough for people to read or hear about them or anything. So June 19th, I believe it is when the next big comparison across all the states come out. So we might see new information and voters reacting after that.
One of the things that we've seen in our first few polls of this year is that people are still getting to know Mary Burke. And so we asked the favorable, unfavorable question about Mary Burke, and how does she fare this time around, Charles?
As we've been seeing for a while, her visibility to the public has been improving, as you would expect for any candidate. In this latest data, 51% still say they haven't heard enough or they don't know enough to say whether they have a favorable or unfavorable view of her. But that 51 is down about 8 points from March when it was 59 and down from about 70 in January. So voters are slowly but steadily becoming more familiar with her. For the first time in this sample, we see a net favorable reading of her, 27% favorable, 22 unfavorable. Back in March, it was 19 favorable and 22 unfavorable. So this is beginning to move a little bit on the balance of favorable and unfavorable as well.
Let's ask the same favorable, unfavorable for Governor Walker.
Well, the first thing you'll notice, of course, not surprisingly, is practically everybody has an opinion about Governor Walker. And so there's only about 4 or 5% that say they're not able to express an opinion about him. In these data, it's 47 favorable, 48 unfavorable, slightly different from his job approval rating. That is something we've seen in the past over most of our surveys, or the totality of our surveys. His job approval rating has frequently been just a shade better than his favorability ratings. Not much, just a shade better, and you see that here. That's also a very modest change from March when it was 49 favorable, 47 unfavorable, again, inside the margin of error kind of change.
Another way to look at candidates, and this is a question we started to ask in more recent polling as the races begin to take shape, is something along the lines, Charles, and you can give us the specifics on it, but it's whether or not the candidate, Scott Walker or Mary Burke, cares about people like you. So it's an empathy question.
That's right. A theme that campaigns often like to emphasize, especially if they think they have an advantage on it. For Governor Walker, he has, for the second month in a row, whoa, that's interesting. Well, I guess the PC up here does not like my Helvetica font from the Mac. Brian, can you make that box go away somewhere? I will just tell you what it says. 44% say Walker cares about people like him. The does not describe is 52% is where those dots are showing up. Showed up fine on my Mac, what can I say? Even on my printout. It's not my fault. It really is my fault. Sorry.
So 5240.
Yeah, let me just walk over here and see if maybe I can. Nope. Not touching that control. You may get another one of those pop up in a minute or two. So just so you know, we'll possibly need you again real soon. So 44, but let's make the substantive point again so it's not lost in the technical difficulties. So when it comes to evaluating, if you will, Governor Walker's empathy for people, in both the March data and again now, he's a little bit underwater. 44% say he cares about them, 52% say that does not describe them well.
Mary Burke.
With Mary Burke, the balance goes the other way. 39% say she cares, 29% say it does not describe her. So 39 cares, 29 does not. But, as you would imagine, given how little people know about her, a much larger 31% say that they don't know enough about her to know whether that describes her or not. So this is one of those interesting things that may stay around through the campaign, is the perception of the governor and his personality and Mary Burke and her personality, and where does this empathy dimension lie, and does that matter to voters or not?
One of the things the governor's talking about in his re-election effort is that he's decisive, that he gets things done. And so we ask people, how do you perceive that? Does he get things done?
And here you see playing to the governor's real strength. 68% say that he's able to get things done. Just 28% say that does not describe him, and a small percentage say they don't know. So in contrast to the empathy dimension, here on the action dimension, if you will, we see a real strong advantage to the governor. When we move to Mary Burke, again, not surprisingly, a lot of people don't know. 38% don't know if get things done describes her. But 36% believe that she is able to get things done. 26% say they don't believe that describes her. As with the favorability ratings, as with the empathy dimension, this action dimension is going to evolve as people form opinions of her, as that 38% goes down to a relative level, while the governor's images have already been well set, and most everybody has already formed an opinion there. I think if I could kind of put this in perspective a little bit, if you look over a lot of the stuff we've mentioned up till now, some things are clearly pushing in the governor's direction. The state in the right direction, seeing the budget in pretty good shape, seeing him as someone able to get things done. Some are much more ambiguous. The jobs picture is certainly highly divided on that. On this empathy dimension, you see a little bit of a disadvantage to him, but on being able to achieve things, or at least get things done, a bit of an advantage. And the sort of the big picture I'd like you to leave with is the idea that some of these dimensions are quite favorable to the governor, others are quite favorable to Mary Burke. Probably that's one of the reasons we're seeing a close race, is that different things are helping each of the candidates.
Something that Mary Burke is touting in her campaign is her business experience. And so we asked a question relating to business experience versus political experience and how the public feels about that, which is more important.
Right. So you might think this one has an easy answer. In one sense it does. People love business experience and don't care that much for political experience. Just to emphasize it a little bit, the question is, which is more important, extensive political experience or extensive business experience? We wanted to emphasize that we weren't just talking about a little bit, but a lot. And this is an issue that's come up some in the campaign, and is a difference between the two candidates. You can see that voters prefer business experience in general over political experience. But there's a partisan breakdown that's also striking. Among Republicans, just 17% say political experience, 75% say business experience. For Democrats, it's 38% political experience, but still more, 46% business experience. And for independents, 25% political and 61% business experience. So there are a few lines that have been thrown around in the campaign that may suggest that this issue comes up at some point, but the public pretty solidly across partisan divisions is more favorable to business experience than political, though with some variation across the parties.
We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about something new in this poll. And I think we can safely say that what we're looking at is how people feel about elections, the integrity of elections, the presence of voter fraud, their belief in government, their belief in their elected officials. It's a government trust series of questions. And why don't you lead off, Charles? We're going to look at the issue of voter fraud right off the bat.
Right. With court cases, with voter ID, photo ID legislation and litigation, this is an important topic. I was joking with someone earlier that there was no way I was going to tell you what the true level of vote fraud is, because that's not something we're able to answer. But I think the broader question that we're interested in is how the public sees fraud. Do they see it as pretty pervasive, pretty limited, isolated to a couple of circumstances, or more widespread? So the format, we asked 4 questions, each with the same format, getting at how extensive possible fraud was. So the choices were, do you think, so for example, someone impersonating another voter at the polls, does that account for a few thousand votes in each election, a few hundred votes in each election, a few dozen votes, or less than a dozen votes? The few thousand is a few thousand or more, so if you think it's way more, you're in that top category. So in each of these 4 wordings, you're getting the choice of thousands of votes that are fraudulent, hundreds, dozens, or less than a dozen. So those are the same across. So our first question is, claiming to be someone else at the polling place. So 20% think that there are a few thousand or more fraudulent votes cast by people impersonating someone. Another 23% say that adds up into the hundreds in each election. And then 21 dozens and about a quarter, 26%, think it's very small, less than 12, less than a dozen. And 10%, which is going to show up frequently, is roughly the number of people who go, I don't know how many. Vote fraud is talked about. So in-person impersonation is the most obvious situation where a photo ID might make a difference. You're showing up at the polling place, you say, I'm Joe Smith. Can you show a photo ID with Joe Smith's name and your picture on it? The second version is absentee ballot fraud, either through fraudulently filling out absentee ballots or some other way, manipulating absentees. There's not a big difference. 20% say thousands of those happen each election. 2,800s, 19 dozens, 22% say under a dozen votes affected that way. And I think one thing I'd call your attention to is the height of these bars only modestly vary across these questions. suggests that people aren't really strongly differentiating, thinking there's a huge problem with in-person impersonation, but no problem at all with absentees, or vice versa. People seem to have much more about an even view across the different issues. The third one we asked about was non-citizens or non-Wisconsin residents voting in elections. Again, these numbers should be familiar by now. 20% say there are thousands of those votes cast, 24% hundreds, 19 dozens, and 26% say less than 12, less than a dozen. But finally, we asked about vote fraud by election officials who fraudulently report vote totals. For this, the thousands are 17%, 27% say hundreds of votes are changed by election officials, 18% dozens, a quarter again think they're under 25, or under 12. And so if you look across there, I think the kinds of alarming statistics are that there's a solid 20% on almost each of these that see a substantial amount of fraud going on. There's a roughly equal 20-25% that think fraud is minimal, and then there's, again, about an even split in the middle that think it runs from a few dozen to a few hundred. But one thing is quite clear, that it's not that no one believes in fraud, and it's not that everyone believes in fraud. There's quite a range across those. We probed it a couple of other ways that dig into this. So the first way is, across these four items, how many people thought there was substantial fraud on at least one of the items? Okay? So that is, how many people said at least a few thousand fraudulent votes, and they might have seen it on absentees, or they might have seen it on in person, or they might have seen it on election officials, but at least once thought there was a lot. That turns out to be 39% that believe there's substantial fraud on at least one way. And finally, turning around the other way, saw less than a dozen fraudulent cases of voting on every one of these four things. So less than a dozen cases of impersonation, less than a dozen of absentee, and so on. That's just 7%. So we're a fairly suspicious group these days. And the suspicion varies by party, but it's fairly high in any case, seeing at least one substantial fraud, okay, the 39% overall. 54% of Republicans fall into that category, 41% of independents, and 25% of Democrats. So there's a fairly substantial amount even among the least suspicious, the Democrats. And there's also some difference when you look at voter impersonation, the thing that's gotten the most attention with the controversy over photo ID. 36% of Republicans believe that accounts for at least a few thousand votes. 20% of independents, but just 7% of Democrats. But when it comes to fraud by election officials, it's a little more bipartisan. 16% of Republicans think election officials fraudulently report a few thousand votes each election. 14% of Democrats agree with them. So about the same level of fear that election officials are falsifying vote outcomes. 21% of independents fall in that category. So again, we see some differences that follow party lines in ways that I think current debates would suggest. But when it comes to a lack of trust in our election officials and the integrity of the tallies that they report, there's still a significant amount of doubt, and there it is much more bipartisan.
And we see that skepticism about the integrity of government reflected in other ways. We ask questions about whether or not we believe government does the right thing in most cases. And, well, you can probably guess what the answer was to that, based on that.
I don't think these depressing results that I'm about to go through will surprise you, though for the most part they continue a downward trend in trust in government that we've been seeing over the last several decades, nationally at least. So a long-standing question that's asked of national audiences, national publics is, how much of the time can you trust, or do you agree or disagree? You can't trust government to do what's right. Here in our data, 67% either agree or strongly agree, the two bars off to the left. So 2/3 are saying you can't trust government to do what's right. Only about 28% say you can trust the government. If we move on to, is government run by a few big interests looking out for themselves? 82% agree or strongly agree with that sentiment. And finally, do you think government wastes a lot of money? We're all the way up to 90% that agree. So I'm not going to bother you with a partisan breakdown, because if you've got 80 or 90% of the public agreeing with these, it's clearly crossing party boundaries. And in fact, when you do look at it, more than half of every partisan group adopt the not trusting position on each of these items. So, the potential consequences for government activity, whether it's your party that's running the government or the other party that's running the government, raise some pretty interesting issues, I think, for how we look at this.
And yet I found the next couple of results, Charles, a bit more optimistic in terms of whether or not people feel that government here in Wisconsin is listening to them.
At least a little bit. And so the question here is, how much do you think the state government in Wisconsin pays attention to your community and what your community wants? This is statewide. It's not specific to any place. So 10% say none at all, 34% say only a small amount. So together about 44% don't think much. But 42% say a moderate amount, and then just 12% say a large or a very large amount. So I suppose after looking at 80 and 90% who think poorly of government, a whopping 42 plus 12, 54% who think the state government at least pays some attention to what they want is better than what the others show. But it still shows a disconnect between state government and local communities, as people see it.
And we asked people whether they felt that people like them had a say in state government. Do they feel like they have a voice?
Again, a little bit, but not altogether. So 20% say that people like me have no say in government. So 20% strongly agree, 28% agree. So 48% altogether feel like they are essentially not listened to or have no say in government. But over at the other end, we've got 33% who strongly or either disagree or disagree strongly with that, and so they do feel that they have more influence. And 17% can't make up their mind whether they have any influence or not in either option. So a little bit more confidence that you can influence government, perhaps, but still a pretty large chunk of people, nearly half, who feel that they have very little influence.
This poll also has a few questions on how do we fund transportation needs in this state. Any of us who has driven on the roads around here knows that there are needs out there, highway needs, local roads. And so we wanted to get at what people were willing to do to address some of our highway needs, our maintenance needs. And so we've offered them different alternatives in terms of paying for this. Why don't you run through the results on that?
Right. And in addition, a little bit of background on this, because we started asking some questions on this topic during the spring of 2013 as the budget was being presented and debated. But it actually goes back a step before that. The previous year, the governor appointed a panel, a commission, to look at options for funding highways and transportation. That panel delivered some recommendations, but none of the recommendations were acted on. Now the Department of Transportation is holding some sessions around the state to talk about future funding needs. And I believe the governor has mentioned once or twice, or maybe someone else has said, transportation funding will be an issue. I know you interviewed the Secretary of Transportation on your show a couple of weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago. And so the reason for asking this is not simply because it's about transportation, but it's a big chunk of the state budget. It's one where previous governors, as well as this one, have started to find it difficult to meet our funding needs. I saw Congressman Ribble is having a session, I think, next week to talk about a crisis in federal transportation funds, where the federal highway fund is threatening to run out of money. So part of the reason for asking this, aside from those potholes that we all get to enjoy this time of the year, is I think this is an issue that's likely to be part of the policy debate for some time to come. So that's the background. We like highways, we don't like potholes. Not surprisingly, we don't want to pay for it. So would you be willing to raise the gas tax or raise vehicle registration fees in order to fund highways? I should say the full question says highways and highway maintenance and repairs. So we're not just talking about new highways, we're talking about the maintenance budget as well. So 40% are willing to see an increase in those revenues, but 58% are opposed to doing that, not willing to do it. One of the things that we did in the current budget is borrow over $900 million for highway construction, but that's not very popular either. 32% willing to borrow money for highways, 65% unwilling. So a lot of reluctance to fund ongoing needs by borrowing. One of the policy potential possibilities is to stop funding transportation only out of segregated funds, a transportation fund dedicated to that, but to perhaps dip into the broader public revenues, income tax, sales tax, and so on. So we asked if you would be willing to take money from other programs to devote to highways. That's 28% willing, 65% not willing. So on these three items, you see an increasing level of unwillingness to give higher tax money revenues, to borrow money, or to take away from other programs to move things around. What's surprising to me, and we saw this begin to emerge in the spring of 13, because it goes against conventional wisdom, is people are surprisingly willing to accept tolls as a way of funding roads. So 56% said they would be willing to use tolls to pay for highways, 42% unwilling. Perhaps this is linked to the fact that it's in effect a use tax. If you don't ride the road, you don't pay it, so it's easy to avoid as long as you're not out on those highways. There's been a practical issue that the amount of highways that we could put tolls on is very limited, and therefore this is not, by most analysts' views, a very likely source of revenue. But just like in the last month or so, the Obama administration has begun to talk about allowing tolls on interstate highways for the first time. And that could be a significant source of revenue. If you put that in the perspective of the federal transportation funds approaching insolvency, you can see why there might be some action at the federal level that would open up this stream of revenue and banish forever the term freeway from our vocabulary.
So the interesting thing, though, Charles, is that we're very reluctant to agree to any other than tolls, any of these options to pay for this. But we all like roads and highways and airports and all that stuff. We think they're great.
And in fact, we think they're worth the money we spend on them. The last question we asked is, are the benefits from highways, rail, and airports worth the cost to taxpayers to create and support them? And a very big majority, 71%, see the benefits of these. So again, as with so many things in government these days, you see this hard division between things that we are really pretty agreed upon as being valuable and even more benefits than costs. But when we come to specific mechanisms for paying for them, much less consensus indeed. In most of these cases, a majority opposed. So this is a dilemma that the federal government will have to deal with for their transportation funds. And here in the state, we're going to have to be dealing with them. And we'll see how this shapes up over the long haul.
We have a couple of questions about same-sex marriage, which is an issue that's in the news a lot these days. A lot of different federal court rulings on this. Wisconsin's same-sex ban is being challenged. We're asking this two different ways this time, and maybe you can explain why.
Yeah. The way pollsters have asked about same-sex marriage has varied over the time. The first same-sex marriage question I can find on a national poll was in 1988. But starting in 2004, pollsters started asking a question that offered three alternatives. Marriage, some form of civil union that's not marriage, or no legal recognition for same-sex couples at all. That became the most common form of the question between 2004 and 2012. And it's the form of the question that we've used throughout our surveys, mirroring some of the question wording from those national polls. But as the issue has evolved in recent years and as public opinion has shifted, the likelihood that civil unions becomes a stable policy outcome seems less and less likely. We're seeing decisions, whether by states and state legislatures or by courts, which are either full marriage or no legal recognition. So as a result, national pollsters after the 2012 election largely stopped using the three-part question and moved to simply a two-part question: legalize, do you favor or oppose allowing gays and lesbians to legally marry? So I wanted to switch to that new form of the question so we can compare the results here with what, since 2012, has become the most standard national item. But I didn't want to simply switch from one to the other, because if you have three options and you move to two, obviously the percentages would shift. So I wanted to be able to show you how the two questions match up and how different the results are depending on how you ask it. And so in this survey, early in the survey, we asked the three-part question that we've used before. And then much later, 19 questions later to be exact, we asked the two-part question so we could see how things change. So that's the background, and that's why we're changing to the new two-option question. And you'll see, there we go. So with the one we've used in the past, allowed to legally marry about 49%, civil union 25%, no recognition 18%. That's roughly where we've been for a while. We've been seeing over the last 2.5 years a sort of steady rise in support for marriage, a bit of a decline in no legal recognition. Civil unions has kind of fluctuated a little bit. But this is in the same ballpark as what our previous results have shown. So when we switch to the two-part question, just legal support or oppose marriage, 55% favor marriage, but now 37% oppose. So I'm going to go back to the previous slide in just a second for you to compare. So 55 favor marriage, 37 oppose. 6% say don't know. We go back to that previous one. Allowed legal marriage was at 49, so that bumps up to 55, about a 6% increase. the no legal recognition that was at 18 basically doubles to 37. And so where are those people coming from? Well, clearly they're coming from the civil union category. When we look at that, we find that those who chose civil union here, about a quarter, 26%, favor marriage in the two-part question. And 65% oppose marriage in the two-part question. So that's why you see oppose go up quite a bit. You see favor go up a little bit. The broad balance of opinion, or at least the broad support for marriage, is not too far different from where it was, high 40s, low to mid 50s, but the change in question wording does have an effect, and this is it. And so now we will from here on be using the two-part question that's become standard in national polls, but you can see how much of a difference it made here and for whom.
Got a few other items here. We'll move through them fairly quickly. A lot of talk about the presidential prospects of both Governor Walker and Congressman Ryan, and so we wanted to find out if the people of Wisconsin would like to see them run for president.
Yeah, we've been asking this for a while because it's a question that just won't go away. Would you like to see Governor Walker run? 27% yes, 67% no. The problem with that question, of course, is it's a highly partisan question, so I think it's important to break it out by party as well. When you do that, among Republicans, it's half, 50% would like to see him run, 39% would not. Among independents, it's 27% run, 68% not. And among Democrats, 9% would like to see him run, 87% would not. So I know you're really shocked and surprised that there's a big partisan difference here. And then for comparison, Congressman Ryan, also a frequently mentioned potential candidate. Overall, a little higher support for a run from him, 38% run, 51% not. Among Republicans, it's 65% that would like to see him run, 23% not. Independents, it's 38 to 51. And Democrats, 19% would like to see him run, 71 not run. So still a big partisan difference, though not as large a gap as there was for the governor.
We asked a question about whether you can do both, whether you can do the day-to-day work of being governor and run for president at the same time.
That's right. Yeah, we'll break this down by party in a second, but overall, 2/3, 65% say you can't both run for president and perform your duties as governor. 31% say yes, you can. I just have to point out that all those governors who've run for president in the past have somehow managed to solve this problem, for better or for worse. But the public is fairly skeptical about it. Even when you break it down by party, though, among Republicans, 45% say you can do both, but 52% say you cannot. For independents, it's 29 can do both, 66 cannot. And for Democrats, 23% say you can do both, 74% say you cannot. So this is, again, an issue that may or may not be widely talked about in the campaign, but it certainly has some implications for how the people think about what this issue is of being a national figure as well as a governor seeking re-election.
We asked a couple questions about Brett Halsey, and we did that because Brett Halsey is a state lawmaker who says he's going to run for governor. Candidates will be filing signatures here in the very near future, so we'll see who's running for governor, but he says he's going to. He is a duly elected official of the state of Wisconsin, and so we asked about it.
Yes. So the first thing is, perhaps not surprisingly, most people have not heard of Brett Halsey. So 87% either haven't heard or don't know enough to give him a rating. Favorable is 2%, unfavorable 9%, so that's perhaps not too surprising for a state legislator. making his debut on the statewide stage.
And conceivably, there could well be a August primary, a Democratic primary for governor. And there are at least another couple of candidates who said they're going to run.
That's right.
So how does that work?
First of all, this is a question asked of Democrats and independents, and there's a preceding question that says, of just those two groups, are you going to vote in the Democratic primary? Okay? So these are Democrats and independents who say they will vote in the primary. 2/3 say they vote for Burke, 3% for Halsey, 1% for Perkins, 1% for Trivedi. 18% say they're undecided, and another 6% don't know who they vote for. So a quarter, 24%, weren't able to express an opinion, and a small percentage, 3%, said, having just told us they would vote in the primary, said they wouldn't vote in this election. It's perhaps not a big surprise that Mary Burke continues to hold a lead there.
One more result, President Obama, his job approval ratings, and we've seen them fluctuate a little bit in recent polls. We see that again this time.
Yeah. His job approval is slightly better than it was. 48% approved, 45% disapproved. In March, it was 47 approved, 49 disapproved. And so you're seeing here in the state, what you're also seeing in the national polling, a modest recovery of his job approval. I stress modest because if you listen to a lot of the rhetoric, you would think his approval dropped 10 points and has now recovered 12 points or 10 points or something. In point of fact, averaging across the polls, it only dropped about 3 percentage points, and it's only made it back up about 3 or 4 percentage points. Individual polls, of course, fluctuate a lot more than that. But on average, there's been a little bit of an uptick, and you see it reflected here. Likewise, in national data, you see voters still are more disapproving than approving of the Affordable Care Act, but disapproval has started coming down and approval has started going up. So the gap between those has narrowed a little bit at the same time that the president's job approval has inched up a little bit.
We've got just about 2 minutes left, so if there's a very quick question or even two, we'll do that, and then we'll go ahead.
Did you do any polling on Attorney General race?
No, and the reason is I'm waiting for that race to become visible enough for voters to have a reasonable chance to become acquainted with the candidates. We'll certainly ask about it soon. But as far as I know, there's been no advertising by any of the 4 candidates at this point.
Quick back there, and then back over here. Yes.
Mine's quick too. 6 congressional races.
I'm sorry?
6?
Yeah, I would love to do that, but with 8 congressional seats and 800 people in our state, if we do anything like that, we'd need to do a special sample just of that district, but not as part of our standard statewide samples.
Yes, sir.
How do you think ads aimed at voters, regardless of partisan affiliation, affect the significance of your questions that take partisan affiliation into account?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I followed the question. I think it's me, not you, but you mean...
Let me try again.
Okay.
A lot of advertising is issue ad or ad that goes to people, goes to the voters, whether they're Democrat, Republican, or anything else. How does that advertising affect the responses you get when you're asking your partisan affiliation?
I see. Oh, okay. Thank you. That helps. It seems very clear that fluctuation from sample to sample moves in a direction of short-term forces that favor a party or a candidate. So in 2012, right after the conventions, Obama came out of the convention strongly in national data. We saw a surge in support for him. We also saw an uptick in Democratic balance there. Then, after the first debate, which was a disaster for him, we saw the balance move the other way. There's a lot of debate, especially in political circles, about whether partisanship is something that's absolutely fixed, in which case the variation from sample to sample is all about sampling noise. I count me in the camp that believes these modest ups and downs are certainly partly sampling noise, but are also reflecting short-term forces that move voters a little bit too. We're not talking about Democrats over here suddenly becoming Republicans or the other way around. We're talking about somebody who's right at the edge between wanting to say, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, and saying, I'm an independent, but, I lean to one party or another. It's that kind of movement. And it's as you see from the data, a matter of 2, 3, 4 percentage points. But that, I think, is responsive to ongoing political events in the campaign.
Before we go, two things. One, we would like to encourage you to look at the poll on our website, law.marquette.edu. It's very transparent. You can see all the questions we're asked. You can see the cross tabulations. Look at it and mull it over for yourself. And the other thing we want to say is that we will continue to poll throughout the rest of this election year. In fact, the frequency will pick up a bit as we move into the heat of the campaign, so we invite you to join us for our future events. Again, thanks to Professor Franklin, and thanks to all of you for being with us today.